G'day again, Blender heads, and welcome to another video in the quick start guide for the Creature Kitbash add-on. In this video, we're going to be talking all about booleans, and more specifically, all the various different ways that they can break. Now, I've used a bunch of different 3D programs over the years, and I have to say, Blender's booleans are probably the most stable that I've come across. That said, booleans are, by their nature, somewhat unstable. And at some point, if you've done enough work with this add-on, you're probably going to break something. So let's talk about how we can try and prevent things from breaking in the first place, and if they do break, how we can go about fixing them. So the first thing that we want to try and get right when we're using booleans is good topology. So you can see here, I've got our little demon kitty again from our first introductory video, although this time I've gone and shoved some nice bird wings on him to make him a little bit more angelic. That said, he's still going to break on us, so bad kitty. Okay, so if we have a look at the cat base mesh here, you can see that with the exception of this back end where I've lopped off his back legs using the lasso trim brush here, which has a tendency to create some pretty bad geometry, but the rest of him is all nice quad topology. It's all of the quads are quite evenly spaced. There's no weird stretching or anything going on. There's no n-gons, again, except for that horrible bit underneath. So that's nice, clean topology. This is what we want to be trying to use. And all of the assets that come bundled with the Creature Kitbash add-on will have this nice, clean topology. Just be aware if you're making your own assets to add, you'll need to follow these rules as well. You'll also notice that if I go and have a look at the bird wings here, it's the same kind of thing. It's all quad topology, it's nice and evenly spaced, it's clean geometry. So if I grab the wings here and grab the cat body and go union, you'll see that that just works. And if I go on the inside here, you can see that that is in fact working. Ignore this little bit here, that's the feather poking through that I didn't join. But the rest of that is a nice clean Boolean merge. On the other hand, the talons back here, first of all, we've got this horrible mess that it's created using the trim tools. I've also just kind of shoved the talons in there without really thinking about it. You can see that like there's little bits that kind of poke through. There's this back end. Generally speaking, when you're trying to merge different bits, it's either better to kind of have them either wrap around the inside, wrap around the outside so that everything kind of wraps around, or shove everything kind of on the inside so that you don't end up with these tiny little bits poking through. Those can cause problems. So this is kind of an ideally bad situation. And if I go and grab these two objects and try and union them, you can see that the cat just disappears. Blender doesn't know what to do with this horrible mess that we've created. So again, ideally, you want to try and get quad topology where possible. So if you're creating your own base meshes, build them with quad topology, make them good to begin with. But as you go along and create assets and try and shove different bits together and merge different pieces, you're going to naturally end up with some bad topology. So what happens if you end up in this scenario? You've created some bad topology and now you just need to find a way to fix it. Well, the fastest and easiest way, I'm just going to isolate the cat here, is to quickly go into sculpt mode. I've already got symmetry enabled here, so let's turn on Dyn Topo. And I'm just going to brush over this horrific area. In fact, let me just go into our settings here. I don't like relative detail, so let's use constant detail, and let's set this to around 60. Now, as I brush over this, you can see that it completely rebuilds all of that geometry. And this was such an offending area that as I smooth it out, you can see that it's still bad. So it's sometimes worth going over it 2, maybe even 3 times, just to make sure that you've cleaned it up as much as possible. So if you can't get quad topology, at the very least try and get this nice evenly spaced topology. So although these are pretty much all tries, I think, they're all about the same size, they're evenly spaced. This should give us a much better result. So if I go and bring back our talons here, let's just quickly go into sculpt mode and just make sure that these are kind of on the inside a little bit. We don't end up with any kind of weird penetrating issues. And with a little bit of luck, Now if I go union, we have a nice join here. And if I go on the inside, you can see that although we do have some messy topology there, this has joined and this would be ready to start sculpting on. Okay, example number 2. This is intersecting geometry. So I've just got 2 really simple spheres here. If I grab this one, shove it in the middle of that one and go and union them, you can see that this has worked. Let me just give myself a little bit more space here. If I move onto the inside here, you can see that that has in fact joined. Let's also turn on wireframe so we can see this a little bit better. You can see that that has worked. We've got one mesh here and we don't have any inside bits that are going to cause us problems. If I just undo this, let's just do this again. Intersect those 2, except before I do anything, I'm just going to select both and go Control J. That makes them one object, as you can see up here. It was 2, it's now 1. And if we go into wireframe mode, you can see that those are still intersecting each other. But now, if I try and union them as one object, if we go on the inside, you can see that it hasn't actually done anything. These are still, they're one object, but they're 2 separate meshes. And this is going to cause us all sorts of problems if we try and sculpt on this. We've got geometry that is going through each other. That's really bad. So when you're using the union, you want to make sure that you are always using separate objects if they're overlapping, and that will work. On the other hand, using the join or remesh, if I just join these and make them one object again, and go into sculpt mode, if I go down to remesh and hit the remesh button, you'll see that this does actually work. So this is the difference between using booleans and using the remesh. Booleans will generally give us, they'll maintain our detail better, but this is a case where a remesh can actually fix some of those problems. So just keep that in mind, depending on whether you want to union or whether you want to remesh, which method you want to use and how your objects are interacting. Now, where this becomes really important, let's use an actual case study here. So I've just got the wolf body here and I've got some tails. As you can see, the tail here is mirrored using the use mirror function. Now, if I try and union these, this will be fine. This will work. But if I now grab the tail, let's just zoom in here. If I kind of cross those over a little bit and now try and union it, you can see that the entire thing disappears. This is the same problem that we were having a second ago. If I just isolate the tail here and bring these together, these are overlapping on the inside. And the way that the add-on works is it takes all of the objects and first applies all of the modifiers. So you can see this is exactly the same as what we had with our spheres before. These are overlapping geometry within the same object, and this is going to break things. So just be really careful of that when you're using mirrored assets. Make sure that you do not cross this center line. Otherwise, you're probably going to run into some problems. Okay, example number 3. Make sure that when you're merging objects or different assets, that you're only selecting the assets that you actually want to combine. So as you can see here, I've got the female head. If I go and hide this, you can see that there's eyeballs and teeth and tongue underneath all of this. So if I were to just select all and go and union this, you can see that, again, half of it disappears. That's because the eyes and everything don't match up to the inside of the skull. We get some weird overlapping geometry and things will break on us. Now, in this example, the whole thing kind of disappears and it's really obvious that you've broken something. On the other hand, if I was to just say select the eye here and select the head and go union, you can see that it does actually work. And we've now kind of merged the eyeball into the skull itself. Most of the time, I'm going to assume that's not what you want. Because when it comes time for rigging, you're probably going to want to keep these eyes separate so that you can rotate them independently of the skull. You don't want them merged into the skull. So just be really careful. A lot of these, most of the heads have eyes and teeth and stuff in them. And if I just go and look at, let's say, the leg, let's bring in a bear leg. You can see that he also has separate claws. So just be careful. Make sure that you're only selecting the bits that you actually want to merge and not all the extra pieces that come with them. Our next example is thin objects. So you can see here, I've just got a plane and a simple sphere. And if I look inside the plane here, you can see it's perfectly flat. It doesn't have any depth. It's not extruded. So if I grab these two objects and try and union them, you can see that we kind of get some strange results. Blender, it needs that depth information to know what to do with it, and in this case, it's just hacked the sphere in half, which is probably not what you want. So you always need to make sure that your objects have some level of depth to them. They need to be extruded. They cannot be a completely flat plane. So now if I go and union these, you can see that we get a much better result. And if I go on the inside here, you can see that this is hollow on the inside. This is what we want. Okay, so that's what flat geometry does if you try and boolean it. What happens if you try and remesh it? So I've just gone and recreated this here. Let's go and hide our sphere. We don't need that right now. So I've just got our flat plane here. As you can see, it is perfectly flat, no extrusion here. So if I just go join and let's try and remesh this, Control R, that actually hasn't done too bad a job in this case. But if I was to go less, you can see we start to get some really strange results where it starts to like overlay vertices, and this is obviously not good geometry. This is going to cause you issues as you go to sculpt. And the lower we go with our remesh, the worse it gets. I think, you know, if you go reasonably high, you can get some better results. But again, the whole idea here is just don't use thin geometry. Just extrude it. And now if I go and remesh that, you can see that we get pretty perfect geometry. So again, when sculpting, don't use thin meshes. So as well as our objects having thickness, we really want them to be what's called watertight. Now, what does watertight mean? It's a bit of a strange concept. Think of it like this. If you took your mesh and you filled it with water and, you know, turned it upside down or whatever, would that water come gushing out? So we've got this female head here, and you might think just by looking at it that this would be fine. But if I tilt it upside down here, you can see I've gone and cut a hole through the neck here. Now, this is not the asset that comes with the pack. This is something that I've modified just for this example. But you can see if we filled her head with water and then just let gravity take over, it would all come gushing out that neck hole. So this is not a watertight mesh. And if I go into sculpt mode and just do a remesh, you can see absolutely disastrous results. This is obviously unusable. So all you need to do to fix this is to go and find any of these kind of holes, do some sort of grid fill or even just a manual fill. If you can do a grid fill, I'd recommend it because it usually does quad topology, which is usually better. And now if we go into sculpt mode and do a remesh, you can see that this does in fact work. I'm just going to crank that density up a little bit. Try and retain some of our details. And that's actually doing a pretty good job. Now, to be fair, I'm surprised it's done a good job, and kudos to Blender for actually making this work. Because if I go and hide the eyes here, you can see that I actually have some additional holes kind of hidden behind the eyeballs. Generally speaking, you would also need to fill those in as well, or you'll end up with results similar to our first one. Like I say, it's actually worked in this case, which is somewhat impressive, actually. I kind of wasn't expecting that to work. But, you know, good on Blender for having a fairly robust system. So, generally speaking, try and fill in the holes behind the eyes. Now, the other one, if I go and smooth this, you can see I've also got another hole hidden here behind the mouth. In fact, I just go and remesh that. Again, kind of expecting this to break, because usually when you've got holes like that, it will break. So if I just go and hide this and bring back the mesh that actually comes with the asset pack, you'll see that if I hide the eyes, those are in fact filled in. And if I go into wireframe mode, you can see that we have a mouth bag. Let me just get rid of the teeth as well. You can see we've got a mouth bag back here. So the lips and everything have been filled in, as has the bottom. So make sure that things are watertight. As you can see, you can sometimes get away with them not being watertight, but as you saw with the big hole in the neck, often it will break. So make them watertight and guarantee that you're not going to run into any issues. And our final tip before closing off this video is just to make sure that before you start doing any detailed sculpting on your characters, just make sure that the interiors and everything have merged correctly. So you can see we've got our strange little snake monster man here. And just looking at him, you'd kind of go, okay, this sort of looks like it's worked. And in fact, you know, if I go inside the head here, look, let's just watch out for his eyeball. You can see that, yes, we've punched a hole all the way through his neck. That's his torso in the back there. So this looks like it's working. You know, come down to the legs and go, ah, yes, look at that. That's a nice hole that's punched through his torso. But hang on, what's this up here? That looks like a strange intersecting mesh. This is actually his arms. And you can see that that is actually a mesh that's kind of, this mesh has been joined. It hasn't been booleaned. Everything else was booleaned. It punched nice holes through it. This hasn't been. And if we were to try and sculpt on this now, well, I actually did this before and Blender just completely crashed on me, which was particularly bad. But at the very least, you'll end up with some really bad results. So you're going to want to fix that before you do too much else. Now, there's multiple ways that you can go about doing that. You could just go and separate all these things by loose parts. Because these are actually loose arms, we could now boolean those back into the body, for example. And if we go on the inside here, you'll see that that is now what we would expect to see. And this guy would now be ready to start sculpting on. So always just make sure before you start doing your detailed sculpts that the interiors of your models are actually working, because if you start sculpting on this and realize, you know, an hour later that you've got these interior meshes, it's really, really hard to fix. So try and fix it before you get started.